In the spring of 1974, in Tillman County, Oklahoma, a 31-year-old woman named Nadine Pruitt walked the length of a dry wash on the southeast corner of her family's 640-acre ration of her family's, and she counted the dead cottonwoods. There were 11 of them. They had died the previous summer when the water table dropped below where their roots could reach, and they had not been replaced, and the wash itself had begun to widen at the edges where the bank was sloughing into the channel during the spring rains. She stood at the far end of the wash for a long time, looking back toward the house, and then she walked to the pickup and drove 40 minutes to Altus, where a man named Delbert Coons ran a small native plantment shearsery out of a converted equipment shed on the east side of Tate. And she spent $47 on 200 mesquite seedlings in 4-inch pots. Her brother-in-law, a man named Gary Pruitt, who farmed the adjacent quarter section and had opinions about everything that happened on both sides of the fence line, saw the seedlings in the bed of the pickup when she got home. He asked her what she was going to do with them. She told him she was going to plant them along the dry wash. He laughed. Not a mean laugh exactly, the kind of laugh a man makes when he is certain he is right. And the other person is about to learn something the hard way the story traveled the way all stories travel in small farming counties. From the Pruitt place to the co-op on Highway 183, from the co-op to the lunch counter at Dube's Cafe on Main Street, from Duke's Cafe to the parking lot of the First Baptist Church on Sunday morning. By the time it reached the church parking lot, it had acquired details it did not originally possess. Some people said she'd spent $200 on the seedlings. Some people said she'd torn out a section of wheat ground to plant them. Some people said she'd gotten the idea from a magazine. The part they all agreed on was the mesquite, a weed tree, they called it. A brush problem that ranchers in the southern plains spent good money every year trying to kill with aerial herbicide and root plows. Something you cleared, not something you planted. The idea of a woman deliberately setting mesquite seedlings along a dry wash in Tillman County, Oklahoma, in the spring of 1974 struck the county as either a joke or a sign of something wrong with her thinking. They were wrong about the thinking. They were going to be wrong about the mesquite, but it would take 15 years to prove it, and Nadine Pruitt was a patient woman. Let me tell you about Nadine Pruitt, because what she did with that dry wash only makes sense if you understand who she was and who taught her to look at land. The way she looked at it, Nadine fakes 140 acres she would eventually farm alone. Her father, a man named Cleo Yancey, had come to Tillman County from a failed dryland operation in Kay County, New Mexico, in 1931, which meant he had seen the Dust Bowl arrive from the direction it came from and understood it as a failure of land management the direction it came from. Cleo Yancey was not a formally educated man. He had finished the 8th grade in a one-room school outside Tucumcari and had educated himself afterward through the Soil Conservation Service bulletins that arrived in the mail, through conversations with the county extension agent, a man named Howard Platt, who drove a green government truck and knew more about grassroots depth than most university professors, and through his own observation of what happened to land that was broken wrong. Cleo Yancey's farm was not the prettiest operation in Tillman County. He left grass waterways where other men plowed to the fence. He kept a rotation that sacrificed yield in good years to protect the soil in bad ones. He planted shelter belts of native trees along the north and west edges of every field he owned, not because the government cost-share program paid him to, though it did, but because he had watched topsoil from his neighbor's fields, blow across the road in 1936, and had decided that was not going to happen to his ground. His neighbors called him conservative. They meant it as a mild insult. He took it as a compliment. Nadine was the second of 4 children and the only one who followed her father into the fields with genuine curiosity rather than obligatory labor. By the time she was 12, she was walking the property lines with Cleo on Sunday afternoons. Listening to him explain what he saw, he taught her to read a drainage pattern from the contour of a hillside. He taught her to identify grasses by their seed heads and their root depth and their tolerance for drought. He taught her that a dry wash was not a problem to be solved, but a system to be understood. That the trees along a wash were doing 3 things simultaneously: holding the bank, shading the water to slow evaporation, and providing cover and mast for wildlife that kept the surrounding land in balance. He taught her all of this in plain language, walking, pointing, sometimes kneeling to pull a handful of soil and smell it. He died in the spring of 1968, a coronary in the field, which was the way he would have chosen if anyone had asked him. Nadine was 25 years older. Her 2 brothers had already left the county, one to Tulsa and one to Wichita, and her younger sister had married a man from Lawton and moved south. Nadine had stayed, not because she had no options. She had been accepted to the Oklahoma State University program in range management in 1961 and had deferred enrollment twice and then let the acceptance lapse when it became clear that her father needed help and that none of her siblings were going to provide it. She had stayed and she had learned, and when Cleo died, she inherited a paid-for farm, a savings account with $14,200 in it, a set of tools in a shop behind the house that included a post-hole digger, a transit level, a soil auger, and a hand-drawn drainage map of Epuyo. She also inherited the dry wash. The wash ran for roughly 3/4 of a mile along the southeast corner of the property, draining a low basin that collected runoff from about 400 acres of mixed wheat and native grass. It had been a healthy system when Nadine was a child. The cottonwoods along its banks had been tall enough to cast real shade, and there had been hackberry and salt cedar mixed in along the lower reaches. And in wet years, a thin ribbon of water had run in the channel for weeks after a good rain. By the time Nadine took over the farm, the cottonwoods were already struggling. The water table in that part of Tillman County had been dropping since the mid-1950s, drawn down by irrigation wells on the surrounding farms, and the cottonwoods, which needed their roots near water to survive, were dying from the bottom of the wash upward. By the summer of 1973, the last 3 were gone. Without the trees, the bank began to fail. The spring rains that had previously been absorbed and slowed by root systems now ran fast and hard down the bare channel, cutting the banks wider and deeper and carrying topsoil off the adjacent fields. Nadine watched this for 1 full season before she drove to Alta's and bought the seedlings. Now the Mesquite. When Nadine Pruitt looked at those 200 seedlings in 4-inch pots, she did not see what Gary saw, and she did not see what the county saw. She saw what her father had taught her to see. Mesquite is not a weed tree in the way that term is commonly used. It is a legume, which means its root system fixes atmospheric nitrogen into the soil, improving fertility in the immediate area around the plant. Its taproot is aggressive and deep, capable of reaching water at depths that would kill most other species. which means it survives drought conditions that eliminate cottonwood, hackberry, and nearly everything else a person might plant along a dry wash and southwestern Oklahoma. Its canopy is light and feathery, not dense enough to shade out the native grasses beneath it, which means it coexists with the surrounding range rather than competing with it. Its pods are high in protein and sugar and are eaten by cattle, deer, quail, and a dozen other species, which means it functions as a mast tree in a landscape that has very few of them. And its root system, once established, is nearly impossible to kill, which means it holds a bank against erosion with a grip that no annual planting program can match. He had read it in a Soil Conservation Service bulletin from 1952 and had spent 20 years watching it confirmed on the land around him. He had not planted mesquite himself because the wash had been healthy when he was farming it, but he had told Nadine that if the cottonwoods ever failed, mesquite was what you put in their place, not cedar, which would take over, not salt cedar, which was already a problem in the lower drainages, mesquite, deep-rooted, drought-tolerant, nitrogen-seeking, bank-holding mesquite. That's why nobody understood the purchase. They were watching a woman executing a land management plan that her father had laid out for her 20 years before she needed it. She planted the seedlings herself over 3 weekends in April and May of 1974, spacing them roughly 12 feet apart along both banks of the wash for the full 3/4-mile length. She used a soil auger to set each one 18 inches deep, backfilled with native soil, and watered each plant from a 300-gallon tank in the bed of the pickup. The total cost, including the seedlings, the soil auger bit she replaced, and the fuel, was $61. Gary watched from the fence line on the second weekend. Let me tell you about the next 15 years, because this is where the story stops being about mesquite and starts being about something else entirely. Nadine Pruitt farmed the 640 acres through the late 1972 with the same conservative approach her father had used. She kept the grass waterways. She maintained the rotation. She watched her neighbors install center-pivot irrigation systems on credit, drilling wells into the Ogallala Aquifer, and planting cotton and grain sorghum on ground that had been dryland wheat since the 1932. Not because she couldn't borrow the money. The local Production Credit Association office in Frederick would have lent her the money without hesitation. She had a paid-for farm, a clean credit history. She could have had a center pivot system on the ground within 60 days of walking into that office. She did not walk into that office, not because she was afraid of debt in a general way, but because she had done the arithmetic. A center pivot system in 1976 cost between $35,000 and $50,000 installed. Depending on the span, the interest on that loan at prevailing rates added $3,500 to $5,000 to her annual fixed costs. Before she turned a wheel, the cotton yield premium over dryland wheat in a good year with adequate water might justify that cost. In a drought year, with the pump running harder and the yield falling short, it would not. And the Ogallala, which her father had watched being drawn down since the early 1952, was not a permanent resource. Cleo had told her that too. He had told her the aquifer was finite, and that the men pumping it the hardest were the ones who would run out of it first. So Nadine kept her dryland operation and watched her neighbors install their pivots, and she put the money she was not spending on debt service into a savings account at the First National Bank of Frederick, and she drove to Altus twice a year to walk the dry wash. The mesquite did not look like much for the first 3 years. The seedlings grew slowly, as mesquite does, putting most of their energy into the taproot rather than the canopy. By 1977, the tallest plants were about 4 feet high, with their characteristic feathery compound leaves and the beginning of the thorny branch structure that makes mature mesquite nearly impenetrable. The bank had stabilized where the roots had taken hold. The erosion that had been cutting the channel wider every spring had slowed noticeably in the sections where the plants were established. Nadine noted this in the drainage notebook she had inherited from her father and continued in the same format, same column headings, same seasonal observation schedule. By 1980, the mesquite along the wash was 8 to 10 feet tall in most sections, and the bank had not lost a measurable inch in 2 years. The nitrogen the root system was fixing had begun to show in the grass composition on the adjacent slopes, where legume species were increasing in the understory. The quail population on the southeast corner of the farm, which had been declining since the early 1972 as the cottonwoods died, had recovered to levels Nadine had not seen since she was a child. She noted all of this in the drainage notebook. She did not tell Gary. She did not tell anyone. She kept farming, kept saving, and kept watching the wash. By 1983, Nadine had $67,000 in savings. Her farm was paid for. Her equipment was paid for. Her annual operating costs were roughly $28,000, covered by her wheat and cattle revenue, with enough margin to add to savings most years. She had no debt of any kind. Her neighbors were not in the same position. The farm crisis that had been building since the late 1972 was arriving in Tillman County with the particular cruelty that agricultural downturns always carry. It punished the people who had borrowed to expand precisely when the expansion seemed most justified. Interest rates had climbed above 18%. Land values were falling. Commodity prices were dropping. The center pivot systems that had seemed like the future of farming in Tillman County in 1976 were now fixed costs that could not be reduced, attached to loans that could not be refinanced at rates that made sense, producing yields that no longer covered the total bill. Nadine watched 3 neighbors lose their operations between 1982 and 1985. She watched Gary refinance twice and sell his cattle herd to make a payment. She watched the Production Credit Association office in Frederick become a place people drove past without stopping, because stopping meant having a conversation they were not ready to have. Her father had taught her that a neighbor's loss was a community's loss, and she believed it. But she also understood that the losses were not random. They were the arithmetic of borrowed money, meeting a market that had moved the wrong direction, and there was nothing she could do about either variable for anyone but herself. In the summer of 1985, a farm adjacent to her southeast corner went to auction. It was 320 acres, good ground with a center pivot system that the bank had already claimed as collateral. The land sold for $380 an acre. Nadine did not bid. She had $71,000 in savings, and the land would have cost her $121,600, and she would have needed to borrow the difference. She watched the auction from the road and drove home. If you have ever watched a community underestimate someone for 15 years and then watch that community go quiet all at once, stick with me, because that is exactly what happened in Tillman County in the summer of 1989, and the dry wash is the reason it happened the way it did. Let me tell you about the 1989 drought, because in southwestern Oklahoma, It was not a drought in the way that word gets used casually. It was a failure. A systemic, compounding months-long failure of the precipitation pattern that the entire agricultural economy of the region had been built around rainfall in Tillman County from January through August of 1989 was 4.2 inches. The 30-year average was 18.7 inches. Wheat yields across the county averaged 6 bushels per acre in the fields that produced anything at all. A significant portion of the planted acreage was abandoned before harvest. Cattle operations that depended on native grass pasture watched their forage disappear by June and began selling cows they could not feed into a market that was already depressed by everyone else doing the same thing simultaneously. The center pivot operations were in a particular kind of trouble. The Ogallala wells that had been running since the mid-1970s were drawing water from an aquifer that had been declining for 15 years, and in the drought of 1989, the pumping demand increased while the recharge rate stayed near zero. Several wells in the county dropped below usable yield by midsummer. The pivot systems sat idle over fields that were burning up, and the loan payments on those systems did not stop because the wells had. Nadine Pruitt's operation in 1989 looked like this. She had no irrigation debt and no irrigation system, which meant she had no additional fixed cost to carry through the drought. Her dryland wheat had yielded 8 bushels per acre, 2 bushels above the county average, because the grass waterways and the established root systems in her fields had retained soil moisture better than the bare-worked ground on the surrounding farms. Her cattle were on the southeast pasture adjacent to the dry wash, and this is the part that the county noticed. The mesquite along the wash had been growing for 15 years. The canopy was now 12 to 15 feet high along most of the channel, and the root systems extended 30 to 40 feet laterally from the main stems, holding the bank and the adjacent soil with a grip that no drought could break. The nitrogen the root system had been fixing for 15 years had built the organic matter content of the soil in the southeast pasture to measurably higher levels than the surrounding fields, which meant the native grass in that pasture held its moisture and its green color longer into the drought than the grass anywhere else on Nadine's farm or on any adjacent property. By the end of July 1989, when the pastures on the surrounding farms were brown to the horizon, the southeast pasture along the dry wash still had grass. Not abundant grass. Not enough grass to carry a full stocking rate through a normal season, but grass green, living, rooted grass in a county where green had become a memory. Nadine's cattle were grazing it in August when her neighbors were hauling feed or selling cows. A man named Delbert Ames, who ran a 400-cow operation on the section to the north, and had been one of the louder voices at Dub's Cafe in 1974 when the Mesquite story was making its rounds, drove down the county road along the east edge of Nadine's property in the first week of August and stopped his truck when he saw the cattle grazing in the southeast pasture. He sat in the truck for a while. Then he got out and stood at the fence and looked at the mesquite along the wash and at the grass beneath it and at the cattle that were eating that grass in the middle of the worst drought in 30 years. He drove to Nadine's house and knocked on the door. She answered it. He said he'd been looking at her southeast pasture. She said she'd seen him stop. He said the grass was still green down there. She said it usually held a little longer than the rest. He was quiet for a moment. Then he took his cap off and looked at it and put it back on. He said, "I remember when you planted those trees," he said. "I thought you'd lost your mind." Nadine said her father had told her to plant them. Delbert Ames nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he is rearranging something in his understanding and wants to do it with some dignity. He said, "Your daddy was a smart man." He said it plainly, without qualification, the way you say something when you know it is true and you are overdue for saying it. Nadine thanked him. She offered him coffee. He said he had to get back. He shook her hand at the door, which was not something that happened routinely between neighbors in Tillman County in 1989, and he drove back up the road. The word spread differently this time. Not from the co-op to the diner to the church parking lot with laughter and embellishment. It spread the way information spreads when farmers are in trouble and someone nearby appears not to be, quietly, person to person, with specific observations. The grass is still green down along her wash. She's got mesquite along that channel, planted it in '74. Her daddy told her to. In September of 1989, a 480-acre farm on the south side of the county road that bordered Nadine's east fence line went to auction. The owner, a man named Curtis Teal, who had farmed it since 1961 and had borrowed against it twice in the 1,980 seconds, had made the decision the bank had been suggesting for 2 years. The land was good ground, heavier soil than most of the county, with a natural drainage pattern that fed into the same watershed as Nadine's dry wash. The opening Pruitt was in the crowd. She had $94,000 in savings. She had done the arithmetic in the drainage notebook the night before in the same column format her father had used at $290 an acre for 480 acres. The land would cost $139,200. She could not pay cash for all of it, but she had watched the opening bids at the last 4 county auctions, and she knew that in a drought year, with credit tight and the operating farmers in the county stretched thin, the competition for distressed land was not coming from the farmers. It was coming from the speculators, and the speculators were buying on leverage too, which meant they had a ceiling. The bidding opened at $290 and moved to $310. A Nan from Lawton dropped out at $330. The bidding moved to $340, held there with 2 bidders, and then moved to $350. At $350 an acre for 480 acres, the total was $155. The other bidder, a land company out of Oklahoma City that had been buying distressed farms across 3 counties, came back at $360. Nadine bid $365. The land company paused. $365 an acre for 480 acres was $175,200. It was above their model for that parcel they passed. The auctioneer called it once, twice, and sold it to Nadine Pruitt of Frederick Tillman County at $365 an acre. She wrote a check for $94,000 at the table and arranged the balance through a note at First National that she paid off in full within 18 months from farm revenue. The note was the first debt she had carried since she had taken over the farm in 1968. She paid it off the way her father would have wanted her to, as fast as the land would allow. They did not make a scene of any kind. What they did was go quiet in the particular way that a group of people goes quiet when something they have believed for a long time turns out to be wrong, and they are watching the evidence of that in real time. Rearranging everything they thought they knew. Quiet. The kind of quiet that is louder than noise. Gary Pruitt was at the auction. He had sold his cattle herd 2 years earlier and was farming reduced acreage on a restructured loan. He stood near the back of the crowd and watched his sister-in-law write the check. He did not say anything to her that day. He drove home and he thought about it, and 2 weeks later he came over on a Sunday afternoon and asked if he could walk the dry wash with her. They walked the full 3/4 mile length of it, from the upper drainage to where it flattened out near the southeast corner. The Mesquite was 15 years old and fully established, the canopy closing overhead in the lower sections, the bank intact and stable, the grass beneath it the only green thing visible in any direction. Gary walked with his hands in his pockets and looked at it for a long time without speaking. He finally said, "How long did it take them to get established?" Nadine said 3 years for the roots to hold the bank. About 7 before she could see the grass difference, he said. Your daddy knew this. She said he did. Gary was quiet again. Then he said, I should have helped you plant them. Nadine said it was all right. She said there was still ground along the north wash on his place that could use them if he wanted to try it. He said he thought he might. Let me tell you how this ends, because the ending is the part that Cleo Yancey would have understood without a word of explanation. Nadine Pruitt farmed the combined 1120 acres. For the next 22 years, she added a silvopasture system on the newly acquired ground, integrating mesquite and native plum thickets along the drainage corridors, and rotating cattle through the improved pastures on a schedule she developed from the drainage notebook and from the soil conservation surf bulletins her father had saved, which he kept in a cardboard box in the shop and consulted the way other people consult reference books. The southeast pasture along the original wash became something that county extension agents drove out to look at on field days, not because it was dramatic or unusual in the way that dramatic and unusual things get attention, but because it worked. Because in drought years and wet years and average years, the grass along the wash held better than the grass anywhere else in the county, and the cattle that grazed it came off in better condition. And the soil underneath it was building organic matter at a rate that the county extension office measured twice, because they did not believe the first measurement. She never needed to. In 2004, when Nadine was 61 years old, her niece, a 23-year-old woman named Cassie Yancey, who had her great-grandfather's name and something of his way of looking at land, came back to Frederick after a year at the Panhandle State Agronomy Program. Nadine said yes. She spent the first summer walking the property with Cassie the way Cleo had walked it with her, explaining the drainage patterns and the grass composition, and the reason the mesquite was where it was and not somewhere else. She gave Cassie the drainage notebook and told her to keep it in the same format. In the spring of 2006, Cassie planted 200 mesquite seedlings along the north drainage on the acquired ground. She spaced them 12 feet apart and set them 18 inches deep with a soil auger and watered each one from a tank in the bed of the pickup. The total cost was $58. Nadine watched from the fence line. In 2011, at the Tillman County Soil and Water Conservation District annual meeting in Frederick, Nadine Pruitt gave a short address. She was 68 years old. The room held about 40 people, mostly farmers and extension agents, and a few younger people from the Natural Resources Conservation Service office. Gary Pruitt was there, Delbert Ames was there, older and slower, but present. She stood at the front of the room and spoke for about 4 minutes. She said that, in her experience, the most expensive thing a farmer could do was borrow money to solve a problem that a slower and cheaper solution would also solve, because the borrowed money created a fixed cost that Exludersa didn't. She said that her father had taught her to look at land as a system rather than a production surface, and that looking at it as a system meant accepting that some of the most valuable things you could do for it would not show results for 5 or 7 or 10 years, and that a farming operation with no debt could afford to wait for those results, and an operation carrying payments could not. She said that the mesquite along her dry wash had cost her $61 in 1974 and had saved her cattle on her southeast pasture to a condition that she expected to still be improving when Cassie's children were farming it. She said she did not know what that return on investment calculated out to, but she suspected it was the best $61 she had ever spent. She sat down. The room was quiet for a moment. Then people clapped, not the enthusiastic applause of her performance, but the sustained, considered applause of people who recognized that they had just heard something true. He said he'd been thinking about what she said. He said he thought her daddy would have liked hearing it. Nadine said she thought so too. She drove home on the county road that ran along the east edge of her property, and in the headlights she could see the tops of the mesquite, along the dry wash, taller now than they had ever been. The feathery canopy moving slightly in the evening wind, the roots 30 feet down in the dark holding the bank, the way they had been holding it since 1977, the nitrogen still fixing, the grass still building, the whole quiet system still doing what it had been doing for 37 years, without a payment, without a loan, without anyone's permission. Let me ask you something. What do you see when you look at a mesquite thicket along a dry wash in southwestern Oklahoma? Most people see a brush problem, a weed, something to be cleared. Cleo Yancey saw a bank anchor, a nitrogen source, a drought reserve, and a gift to a daughter who would need it in 15 years. Nadine saw the same thing because he had taught her to $61. A drainage notebook kept in the same column format for 60 years. The weed tree nobody wanted, planted by the woman nobody understood. Along the wash that proved them wrong in the worst summer in a generation,